So I'm going to start this talk and I'm going to break it down into a few different parts. First, we're going to look at some of the elements that are characteristic of this particular exhibition. Two in particular. One being the Graces themselves, and then two, the fact that Elizabeth has asked the artist to curate part of the show from the collection. That's something that's also a pretty unique feature of this show. Then we'll take a tiny little break so that I don't plow you through in 2 hours, because I feel like I'll lose you. And then we'll get into the three artists themselves. Regarding talking about the artists, I'm going to focus mostly on their background, the work that they've already done, and just to give you a little bit of information about them themselves and not what they're going to do here at the museum. You're going to have an incredible, well, I'm going to have an incredible opportunity to meet with these artists, ask them questions, see what they've installed. So I don't want to be redundant, but what I do want to do is prep you with a lot of information so you can ask really vibrant and interesting questions. A lot of what happens when you go to these sort of artist talks, people ask the same thing and they ask these things that like, they're sort of surface questions, right? And then like the last 5 minutes of the talk is when you really get to the meat of something, and that's the part that's really fascinating. So I kind of want to cut that and get straight to the part that's interesting, because it really is a privilege to have access to the artists in that way. So, starting with the ladies themselves. So the three Graces, or the Charities, I'm going to stick with the Greek mythology, even though there's the Roman equivalent, but we'll stick with the Greek. They're the daughters of Zeus and Eurynomé. Forgive my pronunciation of Greek names. She's Zeus's third bride. And they're often described as Aphrodite's handmaidens or just part of her posse. Sometimes it's said that they are the daughters of Dionysus and Aphrodite, which is kind of an interesting thing and has some validity, considering a lot of what the Graces represent have to do with festivity and merriment, and if we know Dionysus, he's all about wine, food, and merriment. So there's some validity to that theory. There have been more than 3 Graces. Sometimes there are just 2. Their names have changed several times, but popular convention, and what we're going to go with for right now, are that they are Aglaia, Euphrosyne, and Thalia. Again, forgive my Greek. And that goes from youngest to eldest, youngest being Aglaia, eldest being Thalia. We get these names from a poem by Hesiod called the Theogony, which is about the birth of the gods. But the way that we think about them is really kind of like late Hellenistic period. This is really when the idea of the Graces takes off. They are thought to bestow what is pleasurable in society, bring a harmonious accord between nature and civilization, fertility, growth, singing and dancing, festivities, merrymaking. These women know how to have a good time. That's really important. Yet also, like the 9 muses, which they are sometimes associated with, the Graces are attributed with endowing artists and poets their creative abilities. So here's our art connection. And I'm starting with a Roman copy of a Greek statue, 2nd century BC, from which that one in particular is housed at the Met. What I really want you to pay attention to in this particular image is the pose. The pose that these figures are in, right? So forward, back, forward, slightly to the side. This pose is iconic. It comes up again and again and again, as we'll see, and I have a number of examples to show you. But almost more so than the Graces themselves and what they represent in art history, this pose is huge. From a formal point of view, it's an opportunity for an artist to show you multiple sides of one figure while the viewer stays in one place. That's a big deal. This is, this is cinema before cinema. This is how we experience motion. So I can't stress how huge this was. And as I said, it comes up again and again. This is another Roman copy. This one is in the Siena Duomo in the Piccolomini Library. If you're curious, the frescoes in the background tell the story of Cardinal Piccolomini, who became Pope Pius II. I've had the pleasure of seeing that one in person. It's like breathtakingly beautiful. We're all familiar with this one, Botticelli's La Primavera, and they are the three in the corner. Again, dancing that pose, one more time. And this is a really interesting piece, which I know we've talked about a bit when we were prepping for the long forgotten Of Heaven and Earth show. But this painting also operates in a sort of cinema before cinema way. The narrative starts at the left and works its way forward with Mercury, i.e. the month of May, taking a stick and stirring the clouds and changing the seasons. And then we're brought into the Graces, into Venus, who's in the center, and then there's this interesting thing that's happening in the corner where the first, well, this is the focus here. Okay. This is Zephyrus. He's a god of the wind, god of the west wind, and he is currently abducting Chloris. Through the abduction, or through their marriage, she becomes Flora. So looking at these two figures, they're actually the same person. So what you're seeing is the transition of something, like a film, happening all at once in a static 2D image. So the whole thing really tells a story, but also physically describes motion and movement, which, again, pretty revolutionary and wild, cinema before cinema. Raphael, we also all know him. He'll come up again very soon. Another version, this is Rubens. You might have noticed that I'm jumping, like each one is about 100-year leap. This one's a piece by Antonio Canova, and he does something that's pretty interesting and a departure from how the Graces are depicted up until this point. He rotates the second figure. So now you're able to see all of their faces at the same time, but he also rotates the third so that you're still getting that forward-back kind of swirling motion that happens with the three figures. The text is written on the bottom. Also, all of the slides are going to be on the docent website, so you don't have to feel pressure to write names down. Okay. It's also probably the most sensual of the Graces that we've seen up until this point. They're much closer together. Their arms are entwined. There's a delicacy with like how their hands are and the tilt of their head. At the time, it was just enough eroticism for it to be popular, but not so much that it was controversial. So popular that, so the first version that he made was for Empress Josephine. This now lives at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. The Duke of Bedford saw it, he wanted to buy it, so he made another version for him. That's at the Victoria and Albert Museum. There's a plaster model of it, a terracotta model of it, one's in Italy, and then I think there's another one in Germany. So really, you could follow the genesis of this sculpture if you wanted to go on a European Canova tour of the Graces. Edouard Bisson. Picasso. You'll note that this one is not called The Three Graces, but most scholars seem to agree that it's a reference to that and that it totally fits, so I let it stay. And then, I mean, talk about how fast contemporary art and modernity happened. This is a really brief shift, but wild change in art history, just to give you some idea of how fast things evolved over time. This is a piece by De La Grasse Volcano. He or she is an artist really interested in queer identities, gender roles, subversion, working primarily in the photographic medium and primarily with models and portraiture. So what we start to see is how artists are utilizing the graces, putting them in new contexts, and giving new meaning to the mythology. This is a piece by Yinka Shonibare. Yinka's work deals with colonialism, race, class. A really popular body of work involves things that look like this. So they're African fabrics made into 19th century dress styles. He is of African descent. It's been an ongoing scholarly and historical research on his part that fuels his work dealing with these really tough issues surrounding globalism and race and class. This is a piece by Linda Benglis, and they're polyurethane pores. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with Linda, so. And this is a piece by Hong Chung-byung. She is an artist working primarily in charcoal on paper, and she gets this incredible lushness and detail. She has this whole series that deals with hair, some that she pins from the top of the wall that scroll all the way down the floor, so they become this sort of Rapunzel-like carpet. They're just stunning in person. The first time that I saw them, I had no idea that it was charcoal, but she's incredibly craftsful.
Where are those?
This was in a gallery in New York. I forget which one it was. And then this is our friend Kanhindi Wiley, which those of you who were here for Contemporary Art Talk Part 1 that I did last time, we touched on his work a bit. I wanted to show Kanhindi because it's one of the few examples of men being used as graces, which is kind of a pretty interesting and different way of thinking about it. If this painting looks familiar to you, it's because it's based on Raphael's. As I think we talked about a little bit last time, Kanhindi finds young men, usually men of color, but he's mostly known for working with young African-American men who he meets in New York, brings to his studio. He paints them and he has them go through an art history book and choose from a series of historical paintings how they want to be portrayed and incorporated. This is a pretty wild gesture. I mean, they're beautiful paintings.